I despise sequels. Is that really how I'm starting this video? Jesus Christ. My dislike for sequels goes so deep that I have effectively sworn off releasing any sequel-esque videos in this series. The one instance in which I broke that rule resulted in what is easily, in my opinion, the worst video in this series to this point, that being the one about Guild Wars 2's first Living World season. But against my better judgment, I am sorta kinda going to break that rule again, mainly because I have really wanted to do another video about Neverwinter Nights since my Kingmaker episode a couple months back. And it was through a stroke of luck that the recent re-release of Siege of Shadowdale, a classic fan-made module originally published in 2002, gave me reason to talk about this monster of a game once again. Siege of Shadowdale sees the player take on the role of a fledgling adventurer as they do their best to help the sleepy village of Shadowdale, quickly finding themselves wrapped up in a plot that sees them fighting alongside many heroes of Forgotten Realms lore. The module was created by Luke Skull, then known by his nickname of Alexander, who is still active in the Neverwinter Nights community today. Another one of his modules, known as Tyrants of the Moonsea, was recently officially released for the enhanced edition of Neverwinter Nights, and he is currently working on a massive 7-part epic known as the Blades of Netheril. Links to his pages can be found in the description because you should absolutely be checking out his work. My interest in Siege of Shadowdale was driven both by the fact that it's nearly as old as I am, which is a wild reality to even consider, is, as far as I can tell, one of the earliest examples of a fan-made module being released into the world, and also one of the most well-regarded fan-made works for the game, being one of the first modules to be enshrined in the Hall of Fame over at the Neverwinter Vault. If you don't know what the Neverwinter Vault is, it's basically the hub for all things related to Neverwinter Nights modding, and you should go check it out. You'll find that in the description as well. Ironically, in spite of much of that undoubtedly well-deserved reputation, I was somewhat reserved as far as my initial impressions of the module. It struck me as the type of experience that, while great at the time, might not be able to live up to said reputation after being subjected to the sands of time for 2 decades. And I don't know if it's because of the fact that this re-release, appropriately dubbed the Enhanced Edition, polishes a few aspects and adds some new content, but I'm happy to say that Siege of Shadowdale is still really good, and more importantly, really fun. Shadowdale, in a way that is sincerely impressive considering its shorter runtime, the module will only take you somewhere around 6 hours to complete, manages to straddle a fine line between the story that it's trying to tell and the combat situations, and it does all of that while fleshing out the world enough to be consistently engaging. Let's start with the combat, mainly because anyone that has played Neverwinter Nights or watched my Kingmaker video pretty much knows what to expect. This is a low starting level campaign that is geared towards sword and board classes. You level pretty quickly, starting out by terrorizing groups of goblins before you find yourself thrust into a conflict against the Drow. What's more interesting about the combat in this module is that ultimately, it is pretty inconsequential, and it's inconsequential mainly because of the way that most of the experience you earn over the runtime is through the completion of quests and story elements. That means, in a lot of ways, you're not required to take combat all that seriously. And in spite of the inconsequentiality of much of what you fight, and you'll see where I'm getting to with this, the combat still manages to be fun, to the point that you're not going to want to skip it. Many of the boss fights are suitably challenging, and the fast leveling means you'll get the chance to test out whatever bonuses come with the class you're playing. The fact that you don't need to scratch and claw for every experience point from enemies is a good thing because there is a ton of merging between the story and said gameplay. Oftentimes you'll be joined by a number of allies, many of whom are quite a bit stronger than you, that are going to effortlessly swat aside enemies, stealing the experience that comes with them. Works for me, to be honest. I pretty much just started looting as they killed everything. And when you do jump into the fray, it still has everything that makes Neverwinter Nights' combat great. What was most interesting about the story, to me at least, besides the fact that it works in numerous well-known characters from the Forgotten Realms, namely Elminster and the Knights of Myth Draenor, is the fact that you aren't really the protagonist. You're there, and you certainly do your part to help the town of Shadowdale and the surrounding areas, but the idea that you're doing anywhere near as much as the literal legends that you come across just certainly isn't the case. I found this really cool, actually. It's like you get to spectate what's going on, jumping in where it's appropriate and stepping out where it isn't. Your skill set is suited for the message board found in town, and that is where you're largely relegated to. Considering how much it's been done, not necessarily playing the hero that saves the day was a pretty cool angle for the story to be told through. It's not that you aren't important per se, it's just that your character won't be the one they write stories about in the years following the events. It's like you're the bassist in a band. No one knows who you are, but you know deep down that you're really important to the team's success. As for the writing itself, it's well done from a literary standpoint and does a commendable service to the established characters used. The Enhanced Edition moniker that has been attached to the re-release is far more than just a convenient nickname. It adds an assortment of new content to the game, mainly in the form of additional dialogue options, recruitable NPCs, and new quests. It also adds this world map for navigation between areas. I don't know what the hell is wrong with me, but I goddamn love maps, and this one is no different. There's a few new areas, and existing ones have been tweaked somewhat. Everything is still fundamentally the same, but it's cool to see either way. It was through my playthrough that a singular fact became pretty apparent. Titles such as Siege of Shadowdale are why BioWare's official premium modules, such as Kingmaker, failed. There is effectively no reason to shell out cash for Kingmaker when titles such as Siege of Shadowdale exist. Both are very similar in the sense that they're self-contained, character-driven stories geared towards combat, even if they handle that combat somewhat differently, and shorter in length. Not to mention, I think that there is a real argument to be made that Siege of Shadowdale just does a lot better than Kingmaker. Rather than existing in a new world, Shadowdale presents one that most people are likely to have at least some knowledge of. Its combat scales much better as time goes on, and a lot of people will probably appreciate that it doesn't have any arbitrary time limits attached to it. Not to mention the obvious being that it's free. I mean, if I were playing Neverwinter Nights in the time in which both of these modules were released, and I could only choose one to play, I don't see why I would ever choose Kingmaker over Shadowdale. And that is probably the best compliment I can think to give to Shadowdale. It is, at worst, just as good as the official modules, and in many ways is probably better. I do think the module's age shows in certain places, primarily in the simplicity of its format. That doesn't mean it's bad, not in the slightest, but when you take a look at some of the projects that Skull himself has completed in the following years, it becomes pretty clear that Shadowdale was released while the community was still finding its footing with all the newfangled toys that Neverwinter Nights gave them. The way in which the Enhanced Edition streamlines and modernizes certain aspects undoubtedly helps to alleviate that, however. If there was one real issue that I had with the module, it's the fact that if you really want to enjoy some of its narrative elements, you've got to be pretty well acquainted with the lore and history of the Forgotten Realms. If you aren't, then why it's cool that you get to fight alongside a lot of these characters is more than likely going to be completely lost on you. I'm not saying you can't enjoy this module if you aren't a Forgotten Realms nerd, you certainly can, and there is even some supplemental material in the game that grants backstories to these characters and monsters, but it's pretty pointed towards fans of the universe at the end of the day. I will give it points, however, for existing as a story set in the Forgotten Realms that doesn't even make mention of a certain Drow Ranger, especially impressive considering that you spend a good part of the story fighting against a Drow attack. Siege of Shadowdale has more than earned its reputation. Even with combat acting as more of a vehicle to the next plot point, the way in which it presents its story, not to mention its subject matter of said story, makes it more than worthwhile. I sincerely wish I could have talked a bit more in depth about the various narrative beats, but the company policy of the people that locked me in a basement and forced me to make videos precludes me from spoiling things. Whether you played it on its original release or have been introduced to it for the first time through the new Enhanced Edition, Siege of Shadowdale remains a fine experience that is more than worth the time.